Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the brand new video. And today we're going to be talking about the camera I'm shooting on, which is the Sony ZV-E1 versus the camera I've already talked about on this channel, the Sony A7IV. And we're going to be talking about which is the better content creator camera. All right, ladies and gentlemen. Let's talk about some of the key specs that people might be looking at if they're looking at either one of these cameras as their future content creation machine. Again, I'm not going to go crazy detailed, crazy in-depth with the specs. If that's something you're interested in, there's again plenty of other channels that do a deep dive. I'm highlighting it to me what I feel like are some of the key features. So let's start off with the Sony A7IV. It has a 33 megapixel full frame sensor that shoots up to 4K 60, albeit with a 1.5 times crop, and it shoots 1080p up to 120 frames per second, albeit it is 8-bit. That 120 is 8-bit, so it's something to take into consideration if you are a 120 fan. It has a great build quality. It has 2 SD card slots. One of those can be used as a CF Express slot as well. It has in-body image stabilization, and again, it takes amazing, crisp, high-quality photos with that 33 megapixel sensor. All right, so now let's talk about what I'm shooting on now, which is the Sony ZV-E1. And with this, you get a 12 megapixel full-frame sensor. Shares the same sensor as the FX30 and the Sony A7IV. It shoots in 4K all the way up to 120 frames per second. That 120 has a 1.2 times crop, so barely any crop at all. All those are in 10 bits. It also shoots, usable 12 megapixel photos. That could or may not be a limitation depending on what your photography needs are. It has amazing stabilization, and it is small, light, and compact. Also, I don't know if it's a gimmicky feature or not. I've never used it, but it has the Cineblog feature on this. Basically, when you use that feature, it gives you the black bars and it shoots in the S-Cinetone color profile. So take that for what it's worth. All right, so let's talk about some of the negatives for both these cameras. First off, with the Sony A7IV, I have not personally experienced it, but some people have, and it's the overheating issue. In my time I've had it about 2 or 3 months, give or take, and I've never had it overheat on me. I did have the warning come on one time with it, and that was because I was shooting pretty consistently over an hour of 4K 60, and it came on, but it never shut off. And then, I primarily use 24 frames per second on it, and I've used it for long form content such as podcasts, stuff like that, and it's never blinked. It's worked perfectly fine. The warnings never even come on. You do have experienced very bad rolling shutter, especially in 4K 60. So if you're a person that does a lot of whips, transitions, extreme moving the camera around, that can definitely be a negative. You might get a lot of that distorted, warpy looking footage that, some people aren't gonna like, Again, it's not a problem I've had, but again, that is something to consider if, that is a deal breaker for you. And lastly, the 4K 60 crop. It's, it's 2024 going to 2025. I know the camera came out in 2021, but to me at that point, or we passed doing, 4K 60 crops. I mean, I don't know, maybe there's a reason they probably didn't want to cannibalize, the A7S3 or the FX30 sales, because if you put full frame 4K 60, it might have cut into those sales. It might have been a marketing strategy to it. I don't know. Maybe it was a engineering issue. I don't know, but 4K 60 crop does suck. So now let's talk about the camera I'm shooting on right now, the Sony ZV-E1. First negative is, it's a positive and it's a negative. But if you're a photo first primarily person, the 12 megapixel sensor is, can be limiting. It does still take really good photos. That's a non-issue. The issue being is if you need to crop in, if you want to blow your prints up, that can definitely be limiting. Reason number 2 is it does have the same overheating issue. I've had this thing for couple weeks. So that's not long enough really to tell you if it's an issue or not, but it is documented that this camera does have an overheating issue. So definitely keep that in mind. This right here on the side, you can't see it, but the micro HDMI port, you know, I've been good with mini HDMI. Didn't necessarily have to be full size, but when I have the FX30, I use the FX30, the Sony A7IV, the Sony A7S3, they all have full size HDMIs. So, you know, having a micro kind of sucks. Like I said, I've been okay with mini, but it is what it is. And then lastly, the build quality. It's definitely feels, it doesn't feel bad. You know, I've seen people online like, oh, it feels like a toy camera. It doesn't feel like it. It feels good in the hand as far as like the build. It doesn't feel like it's gonna break, drop it. But it's just not as premium as the Sony A7IV or any of the A7 lineup. Definitely not as premium as like the FX30 or the FX3. So build quality wise, it is, you know, not the best. But again, it's not that bad. It is small. It's almost too small, and some, you know, not as small as the Sony ZV-E1 that I used before, but it's still pretty small. I had to put a cage on it to kind of give it a little more girth, a little bit more, just a little more weight to it. So, you know, that can definitely be deterring. And I have, you know, decent size hands, you know, they're not super long or super big, but they're not small hands. So I definitely feel, you know, when I hold that battery grip, there's not a lot of real estate there to hold it. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so now let's compare these cameras and let's come up with a, you know, thought as far as which one is the better for a, you know, content creator that's looking to upgrade his camera, his or her camera, I'm sorry. Let's start with what I'm shooting on right now, the Sony ZV-E1. Now, when it comes to video specs, I mean, hands down, I think this guy is a more superior camera when it comes to video. You know, you have the Sony FX30 and Sony A7S3 sensor inside this camera, so low light capability is off the charts with this guy. You know, the 640 and 12,800 as far as ISO performance is great. Dynamic range is great. You get to shoot 4K all the way up to 120 frames per second. So, I mean, video wise, you know, I think it's definitely a more functional camera. Rolling shutter is virtually non-existent. So yeah, when it comes to video quality, video specs, just as a pure video camera, I think this guy is the better option. Now let's pivot to photo. Again, it takes capable photos at 12 megapixels. They're good photos. There's nothing wrong with the photos. They're definitely good enough for, you know, social media content. You know, people aren't going to be pixel peeping, zooming in on your photos, being, oh, that's a 12 megapixel photo. You know, people aren't going to be doing crazy shit like that. So, but when it comes again to photo capabilities, this one is definitely not as good as the A7IV. So now let's talk about the A7IV when it comes to the content creator camera, where that is the better option versus the Sony ZV-E1. Let's talk about video specs. It shoots 4K up to 60 frames per second. Again, with that 1.5 times crop. Hate it or love it, that's what it does. It has pretty bad rolling shutter, so you know that can definitely be a deterrent for some people. It shoots in 1080p up to 120, so it's definitely not as spec heavy video wise as the Sony ZV-E1 is. One positive it does, I won't say one positive, but a positive it has over the ZV-E1 is the sensor is a 7K downsampled 4K image. When you're shooting 4K on the Sony A7IV, you're going to get a sharper image. And also what I've noticed between this and the Sony A7IV is those low to mid ISOs between, you know, the Sony A7IV has a base ISO of 800 and 3200, and in between those base ISOs, even though it doesn't go as high as this does with the 12,800, the noise performance and, like I said, those mid-range ISOs, I believe from looking at it, it looks a lot better. It still has noise, but with that 7K sensor, the noise pattern is a lot smaller than the 12 megapixel sensor's noise pattern. Now, again, where this thing takes the lead is when you get to that 12,800, it cleans right up. I pushed the A7IV up to about 10,000, and it was, still very usable. So it definitely does very well when it comes to low light performance. It's just not quite the low light monster that this 12 megapixel sensor is on this camera and the FX30 and Sony A7S3. So video wise, I think it's definitely a little bit behind this, but I think where it jumps up on it is the photo capabilities. Again, you have that 33 megapixel sensor, and you get, again, amazing photos out of that thing. I mean, just image quality wise, you're just going to be able to do so much more with the photos you get out of the A7IV than you would be able to do out of this camera. So yeah. All right, ladies and gentlemen, so I'm going to wrap this video up and kind of give you my thoughts as far as which one of these cameras is better for content creators. You guys heard my comparison of both the A7IV and the Sony ZV-E1. So let's start. If you are mostly a video person, you are 95% video and photos is very little, maybe a couple photos here for social media, stuff like that. You just don't take it that serious. The video is what you're doing. 100 times out of 100 times, I'm going to recommend the Sony ZV-E1 just because you have more video functionality. You have no crop in 4K 60. You have 4K all the way up to 120 frames per second. The rolling shutter is better. Stabilization is better. So yeah, when it comes to video, I just feel like that is the better option. If you're a little bit more photography driven, then obviously I'm going to lean towards the Sony A7IV just because it is the superior photography camera with that 33 megapixel sensor. And if you're kind of a hybrid, you're a 50-50 person, you do photo and video pretty much equally, then again, I'm going to the Sony A7IV because it is still a very capable and a beast of a video camera, and it is a beast of a photo camera. So if you land kind of in the middle, or maybe you're like 60-40 one way or the other, the Sony A7IV is kind of where I go. So again, if video first, Sony ZV-E1, photography first, Sony A7IV, and if you're kind of in the middle hybrid, do a little bit of both, then Sony A7IV. So I guess if you're a crown winner for the best camera for content creators, if they're looking at either one of these two cameras, the Sony ZV-E1 or the A7IV, it's going to be the A7IV. So anyways, guys, hope you enjoy the video. See you at the next one.